Thanks for joining us. As we said, my name is Ashley Wilson, and let me introduce my fellow friends, my guests. To my right, Esther and we just had a discussion and not butchering in this pronunciation too. Esther Anatolitas. It's not hard. I should have got that without drawing attention to it. She's the editor of Meanjin, the honorary associate professor of RMIT School of Art, and a member of the NGA's governing council. She's the author of Place, Practice, Politics, and the editor of the anthology in front of me, Essays That Changed Australia, Meanjin 1940 to Today. Her latest book, When Australia Became a Republic, will be published later this year. Halfway there. Brooke Boland, a freelance writer from regional New South Wales, Geringer and Wandian country. Her creative non-fiction has been published by Griffith Review, Meanjin, Overland, and the Sydney Review of Books. Her debut collection of essays, Gulp Swallow, again in front of us, was published by Upswell in 2024. David Martin needs no introduction, but we can try. His books include The Majestic Patrick White Life, The High Price of Heaven, Dark Victory with Marion Wilkinson, Panic, My Country, which for proof with the photo in front, Killing for Country, and 6 quarterly essays. He's written for The Herald, The Age, The Saturday Paper, The Monthly, and The Guardian, and has been a reporter for The Four Corners, presenter of Media Watch, and currently Late Night Live. My Country, recently published by Black Ink, is a collection of stories, speeches, and essays from 45 years of writing. Everyone on this stage, apart from me, has appeared in Meanjin at some point, so I figure that's a good place to begin. I'm sitting next to the editor, so maybe I can work on that for one day in the future. In 1945, one of Esther's predecessors, Clem Christensen, wrote this. This was the first peacetime issue of Meanjin. He wrote, he was writing about the responsibilities of the writer. We ask him to reveal and clarify our life by showing it to us through a vision different from ours and deeper. We ask him to organise the conflicting welter of impressions, which are the actual process of living, into the ordered integrations of experience, which are works of art. By becoming part of the uniqueness of our time, we finally merge with the eternal. Now, that's a lot of responsibility to put on the essayist. But I thought we could examine the duties of the contemporary writer first, maybe by going back to basics, because let's examine what the form is. This is all about the essay, so I thought we'd begin with Esther and simply ask, what is an essay? It's not quite an op-ed, not quite a feature, not quite a piece of analysis, but it's got little bits of everything.
It's such a good question, and can I just say hello, everyone, and it's an absolute honour to be here on Darkinjung country. I just want to pay respects to elders and thank them for their continued custodianship of this incredible place where we are very, very fortunate to be today. Essays are super powerful, and when the idea for this anthology first popped into my mind, I couldn't believe that there had not yet been an anthology of Meanjin essays. Meanjin has been known as the place where, some really critical, important, impactful work has been published. And of course, there'd been anthologies of Meanjin poetry and fiction and sort of general anthologies, sort of anthologies over time. But essays do something really powerful. An essay is a writer's opportunity to say, this is a position that I'm taking, and here are some reasons, here's some evidence, here's some argument, here's some passion, here's some rigour, here's all the reasons why I want you to come with me on this thinking. And there's also something quite powerful, almost on an oratory, you can hear a great essay. If you know the writer and their voice, you can hear it in their voice. You can sort of hear it spoken. And an essay is exhorting, it is compelling you to recompose your thinking, but also potentially to take some action. And that particular editorial of Clem Christensen's that Ashley just read, so Clem Christensen was the founding editor of Meanjin, and in his editorials, he often wrote in this very kind of strong, it's often been characterised as crusty, but he wrote in a very kind of, clear and unapologetic way about the responsibility that he sees writers and artists taking, the responsibility that he sees as being something that can't be denied. And in post-World War II Australia, Clem was really compelling and exhorting writers and artists to take their particular responsibility for the Australia that we were all creating together. And so it's that combination of the essay being that, that literary form that you can sit down and read in a sitting, it'll galvanise you in a particular way. And then there's Clem's challenge to the artist, the writer, the person who is writing the essay or poem, or he meant more broadly in this sense. He's really inspiring and asking the writer, the artist, to think of themselves as being as responsible for the future of Australia as people elected to guide that future.
That's cool. Thank you, guys. David, do you feel responsible for guiding the future of Australia?
I'd like to be. I'm not sure that, for me, that an essay is defined by its purpose. I think the thing that defines an essay is that it's short.
But can you have an essay with no purpose?
Well, the purpose can be to show off, amuse, but, well, we write with a purpose, of course. But I've absolutely loathed those things that you see, as I'm sure lots of you in this room are like me, addicted to the New York Times online, and it tells you how many minutes it's going to take you to read something. A 3-minute read, and I just can't bear it. But I know, I always look and see how long it's going to... And a 10-minute read, I think, have I the time? But essays are short, and one of the ways of defining an essay is a powerful courage to leave stuff out and to work out what actually matters. It's also a question of tone, and that's dictated by the notion you have of your audience. And I've always liked the idea that an essay is like talking around a table. And while we writers use every trick in the book to remind our readers of the facts they might have forgotten or tell the bastards what they've never known, but we do it in a conversational way, and we do it as if we are talking amongst ourselves. And the really great essays aren't declamations. They certainly aren't academic papers, but they're conversations amongst ourselves in which what matters most is insight. The facts we kind of know, but this is the insight I bring to them. And the essays that we really remember are also essays where some writer has, by magic, by skill, by divine luck, come up with a few phrases that are never forgotten, like the cultural cringe. That's a phrase invented. It defines exactly what is being spoken about. It's never forgotten. It remains a topic of conversation and scrutiny. The lucky country, now that was not in an essay, but it was in a book, but the lucky country, the great phrase that I've never come up with such a phrase. I've been trying for 50 years and they've evaded me. Though, I was having to flick through... by the way, this is not me, you can tell. That was a version of me some time ago. But the publishers had free rights to that photograph and they weren't going to pay for another photograph to be taken. You'd understand that. But I've tried to come up with phrases. It hasn't really worked, I don't think. But the other thing about an essay is that it can be a meditation as well, which means that it's not constructed as an argument. It's not QED. It's the meditation on a theme or on an insight or on an event which brings understanding to it. And in that way, it's not a newspaper. It's not a newspaper story. Although the essays most of us most often read are the op-ed pieces in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Guardian. Those op-ed pieces, they're essays. Good political commentary is essay. And so they're part, actually, of our lives all the time. And at that point, I'll shut up.
We'll come back. Brooke, David mentioned papers.
Yes.
The art of writing papers. Just wondering about your approach to what we're talking about here, but also, because you've put your toe into those waters yourselves, writing papers, and what the common ground, but also the departure points.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to add to expand on what David was saying. I do also agree that the essay as a form of writing is short, and I really love playing with the length. I actually struggle to write anything over about 3,000 words, so short and sweet is kind of my go-to, and the editing process and cutting down and refining is critical in that. It's conversational. For me, it is about poetic thought as a way to both think and feel, and I think the essay is particularly adept at capturing that. When we're talking about academic papers, I used to work as an academic, casual academic, and I have a PhD in literature, and I did that teaching and things like that for a number of years. But the transition into essay writing was really an opportunity to move away from critical analysis, which might sound odd considering the essay is often analysis. But there's a fantastic essay by Jane Tompkins. It was published in 1989, and she writes really beautifully about that challenge of wanting to write how you feel and that being unacceptable in an academic context. So how can you capture this kind of lived experience that is so important? And she's coming from obviously a strong feminist background in what she's writing about, and the personal, obviously, as a tenet of feminist thought, the personal is always political. So how do we share these stories? Moving away from academia, it was at a particular time when I was unable to read and write as someone with postnatal depression. So entering back into essay writing was really a way to think.
Thanks. I want to get into some of the books in front of us. Now, My Country here is an impressively sized
thick
book. Yes. But it took some selection because that's, 45 years of writing. Obviously, if you put them all together, it would be slightly longer. I'm wondering about the selection process. And
it was bitter. It was bitter.
But more specifically, though, when you went back, did you feel the urge to... I know some writers, when they've been edited once, when they're republishing, they go, fantastic, I can re-edit it the way I wanted it.
Well, first of all, let me get the bitterness off my back. I got my work down to the absolute core, high quality, this work should survive. But unfortunately, it was twice as many words as the publishers were willing to accommodate in a single volume. I argued for the second volume, and they argued against it. They simply said no. So I then, having spent much too long choosing the absolute minimum, I then had to halve it. And at first it was incredibly painful. How can my readers not have that piece? It was really painful. And then it became unbelievably exhilarating. That goes, get rid of that, and I'm not sure how rational that weeding process was. But I have to confess that here and there I did tidy one or two things up. I had to open it again this morning and have a bit of a look and just sort of to try to capture the feeling of it. And there were things that still needed to be fixed up. But it's too late now. I just didn't get absolutely right the description of Pauline Hanson coming onto the stage in a Tasmanian country town about 25 years ago. I had the description of her shoes, her little gold shoes, in the wrong place in the opening sentence. And it should have been a little bit later. And, in my view, that no one could have read past that mangled first sentence as it was. But it's too late. It's too late to change. I did a bit of tidying up. I did a bit of chopping. And also I added some little notes here and there just to explain what happened what was the outcome of a particular story. Yes, he lost the election, that kind of thing here and there. And it was an intensely vain and so it wasn't soul-destroying, really, because I was so pleased with myself often. But this is the second edition. It's slightly augmented. There are a few more pieces in it, and a vital change has been made to the introduction, because in an unbelievable stroke of vanity, the book is called My Country, and it begins that my little introduction, which is only 2 pages, prefaces. I hate prefaces. It's just a really brief preface. It begins, "My country is the subject that interests me most, and I've spent my career trying to untangle its mysteries." And I absolutely still agree with that. Unfortunately, in the last paragraph, I had written, this is the second edition, I had written in the first edition, "I know my country now." And it was about 6 weeks after the first edition was published that somebody pointed out to me that my great-great-grandfather had been a professional killer of Aborigines. And that took me much deeper into this country than I have ever been before. So the sentence now reads, "I can't claim they've had much impact on the country I once thought I knew, but find I am still getting to know."
My Country, Essays That Changed Australia, these are big themes, of course, but Esther, you've gone through this whole process with a different sort of vanity, the vanity of an editor's eye, when you can look through, and some of these pieces you had a hand in, some came before you. Tell us about what made it in, what doesn't make the cut, but also I wanted to get into the title of your book. I want to ask you to justify it. Like, how are these essays together? What effect have they have, and how have they changed Australia?
It's a kind of vanity, or maybe it's the opposite of vanity. It's a great assertion and commitment to the courage and the impact of the writers that Meanjin has published, to be able to quite happily assert that these essays have changed Australia. And so I set the bar pretty high when I started. And of course, in terms of, speaking to potential writers and thinking about their consent, many of the writers who I have featured are in fact deceased. And so that was not a factor. But when I contacted writers who are not deceased, many of them were really taken aback. Oh gosh, do you think my essay has changed Australia? And I said, well, Amy Maguire, your essay sparked a royal commission into the disappearance of Aboriginal women. Or when I've spoken to the widow of Jenkins' essay on the creative city, she always had the sense that it had a huge impact. But it wasn't until David had been gone for quite some time that essay on creative city is in fact the first articulation of this notion of thinking about urban development and the future of cities from the point of view of artists and the role that artists play in developing the life of a city, but also contributing to things like cycles of gentrification and so on. David Jenkins' essay sparked a global creative cities movement, which is often associated with the American Richard Florida, but came well before him. There are essays, as David's pointed out, including Arthur Phillips's The Cultural Cringe. It's an everyday, almost, it's an idiomatic Australian expression now. It began its life as an essay in Meanjin. And so my criteria were numerous. There were some, quantitative ones, which were the most cited essays, the most referred to essays in news media, in print media, in scholarship and so on. That gives you a sense of, what impact looks like. But then which essays had a real impact on how we see ourselves as Australians, how we understand Australia. And so there is a really broad selection of essays there from the beginnings of Meanjin till today-ish. And this summer, Meanjin turns 85. So it was a great deal to choose from. There will actually be another anthology that comes out in around November this year, which is called First Nations Writing, Meanjin 1940 to today. There'll be a couple of surprising things about that, including its title, which you'll see when it comes out. But that is guest edited by Auntie Janine Lean, who is our poetry editor and the winner of this year's Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Poetry, and Dan Borscher, who you would know as a journalist, writer, facilitator. Obviously inappropriate for me to have edited that one, and that's also been that real challenge of them getting in touch with writers saying, we want to include your piece, and one or two writers saying, well, I'm really thrilled that you love that essay or poem or work of fiction, but actually when I look back on it, I'm not so happy with it in terms of how it sits in my body of work. Would you mind terribly if I said no, or perhaps we could choose another one? And then that kind of goes to, how a writer perceives their work. And there are obviously, there are going to be cultural factors there in terms of how was that work commissioned, on what basis and so on, when was it first published. But then, the contrast there, and when I think of some of the writers who are deceased, what they would think today to be included in an anthology called Essays That Changed Australia, I think some of them would be really quite taken aback, shocked, put out, annoyed, bemused. Who knows?
Was there a re-editing process? As in, I noticed that, I think it was Tim Rouse, he was given the opportunity to, or I assume he asked for the opportunity to revise a particular perspective, but I think he's the only one.
Yeah, so when I contact everyone, and this goes to the sort of, the legal sort of specifics of publishing and republishing. Technically, Meanjin, as the copyright holder, has the right to republish works. Obviously, I wouldn't dream of republishing someone's work without approaching them. And so I got in touch with all of the living writers and explained what I was undertaking and why I had selected their piece. And Tim was one of the writers who said, look, actually the position, the sort of political, socio-cultural position that I have taken since that time has changed. And do you mind if we just put a little note on it? I said, look, happily, and I will also publish that note on the online version because the pieces are available online to subscribers as well. And that was the only such response that we had because, of course, it's very different to have a piece published in a journal at a particular time and then have it represented in this way to new audiences, many of whom I'm sure will never have heard of Meanjin and its its role over the years.
Let's get into Gulp Swallow, which is such a lovely title, and when you come across the passage in Brooke's book where it describes the point that brings us to that title, and it's almost worth the book alone just for that moment. But and I was talking earlier with Brooke. I wanted to somehow bring into this conversation her chickens, but I can't think of a way to do it. But their names. Tell us their names. I have a question after this.
Okay. I had the fantasy of chickens, and then very briefly had some chickens. So there was Judy Plume, Judy Dench, and oh my God,
I've got them written down. They're your
forgotten.
chickens. Judy Plume, Judy Garland, Judy Dench.
Judy Dench, and Sunday Roast, who was a rooster.
Designated from birth, Sunday Roast.
Sunday Roast. Given to me by a really dear friend because I was living on about 5 acres down the south coast. Beautiful property, largely rainforested, but there was a chicken coop and I always wanted chicken, fresh eggs. Like I said, the fantasy of raising chickens. She gave me some baby chickens, which my son grew very attached to. They lived in my study for the first few weeks of their life in a box because they were so little. But one day I came home and Judy Plume, who was my favourite, she was gold and just beautiful, and she was just starting to get all her feathers. Her sisters and brother had ruthlessly plucked all of her feathers out and she was dead. And then I rang Amy and was like, please come and get the chickens because I can't do this anymore. But yeah, so it was a very sad story. And yeah, it was supposed to be Sunday Roast. But
when you do the anthology of great writing about chooks, don't forget Patrick White. He loved writing about chooks, and particularly their brutal behaviour to one another. He took it as an image of human beings.
Oh, fantastic.
My home in Greece also has chickens, and one year my parents thought, we should get them a rooster. They look like they might need a bit of company. So my parents brought the rooster, and the next day the hens had murdered him. They were very happy with their own company.
Chickens kill. It's in your book, you write this: with the advantage of an outsider's viewpoint, I've entered this community as an interesting social experiment, but I'm also heavily invested in my ability to integrate. Now, for those who haven't yet had the chance, and you will have the opportunity straight afterwards to grab some copies, Brooke writes about moving from the outskirts of Melbourne to Jervis Bay and the integration process. But what if you can talk us through the idea of looking from the outside in, because this is a process familiar to a lot of journalists, where eventually you bump into a subject of a particularly harsh story down at the coffee shop, and you don't make eye contact or something, and it particularly helps if you're a print journalist because they don't recognise you. But where you are, Brooke, you're running into into your subject matter every day, and you're living with these with this community that you're also trying to investigate as a social experiment, as you put.
Yes. Yes. So the book was written rather privately, and I think quite naively. I just imagined that no one would ever read it when it came out. And then, of course, they did, and there has been some conversations about representation of people in the book, which I've addressed, I think. It was, like you said, a kind of that deep observation of people around you when you are an outsider entering into a small community. There is an experience, I think, of alienation that occurs. The locals are very deeply embedded locals, usually for generations. And then you have, when you're living on the coast, a large tourist kind of population that visits regularly. And then there's the outsiders that try to integrate. It took me back a bit how challenging that process was. And I think that's one of the impetuses behind writing was trying to understand the community that I lived in. And where I fit in with that dynamic, and having a small child was really kind of an entry into that as well.
I'm just taking my watch off, by the way, not because I'm... just so I make sure that we have time at the end for questions, and I don't want to lose track of the time. And so there will be a moment for questions, and given the theme of today, we're not looking for essay-length questions. Brevity is the key, but I want to talk about character for a moment. Now, David, in my country, there are a lot of names still part of our common discourse: Pell, Rudd, Howard, Hanson, Whitlam. Others that have faded rather more into obscurity: Brian Harradine, Captain Rinnan, Alan Jones. Something... We're not allowed to say any more than that. Something's gone right, though, when the passion that you've written and the points that you're making a generation ago still ring true now. So I'm wondering if you can talk us through that process of how you don't necessarily need to know the nuances of Brian Harradine for these pieces to work. But also, you were talking about your introduction before. You write in it that, let me quote it, that you call character the great neglected subject in politics. Tell us about that.
It's not so much neglected now, though it is still neglected, but it came to me that there was this strange division between the writing of contemporary politics and the writing of historical biography. And that if you were writing a biography of Jack Lang or I don't know, some other sort of Casey or Billy McMahon, and by the way, one of the finest political biographies of the last 20 years is the biography of Billy McMahon called Tiberius with a Telephone. It's a completely wonderful book. But if you were writing historical biography, you would spend a great deal of time working out the character of the subject and the way in which the character was expressed through the life, the way in which the character either helped or hindered the career of this person, the impact of what they had done. And yet, talking about contemporary politics, character was a sort of no-no. You could talk about cleverness, you could talk about strategic skill, you could talk about some ideas, and maybe you could talk a bit about values, and you could talk about factions and pressures, but character didn't get a look in. And when I started writing biographical essays, and well, I started with a biography. The first sort of book I wrote was about Garfield Barwick because of his role in 1975, which remains for me the most important political event of my life. And I knew that I had to write about his character to make sense of that. So if I'm writing about his character, and he was still Chief Justice when I published that book, then the character of contemporary players in politics mattered too. So I've written a number, as you said, 6, can it be 6 quarterly essays? Now, quarterly essays are really up against the length issue. They're short books, but they're very short books. They shouldn't be more than 40,000 words, so mine are generally about 55 to 60,000 words. And in those, I explored, as much as I could, the characters and watched and recorded how I believe those characters played out in their careers. And that's remained for me a very important way of judging the politicians I'm fascinated by the character of Tony Abbott, who is probably the worst Prime Minister, amongst the worst Prime Ministers this country's ever had. I'm fascinated by the character of Morrison, that strange capacity of religious believers to be able to invent anything. Because if you've invented a God who is going to give you everlasting life, you can invent anything, and multiple ministries is just nothing. It's just a bip. But yes, I've always been interested in character.
I just want to throw to you, Esther, to respond.
What's really interesting about what David has just said there is that there's character in terms of how we craft when we're writing an essay. I'm writing a short book at the moment called When Australia Became a Republic, which is out in October.
We've obviously got to get a wriggle on.
And it's structured around particular years in Australian history when Australia became a republic. And in each one of the very short sections, there are characters and what their contribution was politically, culturally, etc. And there's a sense when you're crafting an essay, which obviously has its foundation, non-fiction, but you're crafting something, you're crafting it as a writer so that it compels the reader through. But what David was just saying about character in the political sense has got me thinking about the character that is fabricated by a politician to give the electorate something that they think should be the role of the politician. And so what does that then say? I think in general we're very good at, just as because of who we are and how we engage in the activity of being human beings together, we tend to have pretty good bullshit detectors, and we can see a character that's being fabricated. And if we look back on the politicians who fabricated characters in order to secure office, none of them lasted very long because we saw through them very, very quickly. But they felt that they had to fabricate that character to be politically successful. But when we as writers go back in history to kind of, craft, as a writer, to create that assemblage of character so that we can focus the insights, as David was saying, or lead to that personal moment, as Brooke was saying, or the sort of that call to action, what stimulates us in the way we read an essay. We're not fabricating character, we're illuminating, we're casting a spotlight, we're using our craft as writers in particular ways. And perhaps as writers, particularly those of us who are journalists, we're very, very mindful of the fabricated character that a politician dares to impose upon us. And you do sit back and think, mate, that's not going to last long.
I think one of the rare pleasures of all these books is that, I don't know about you guys, but a lot of the reading I do at the moment, certain words come up too much, and you don't see the words Trump, Musk anywhere here. I could be wrong, David, but maybe they make an entrance in passing, but these are not Trump-focused books. And it's a rare pleasure not to have to... another one. But, Brooke, we're talking about other people's character, and of course yours looks more inward.
Yes.
There's this passage in your book that I want to read. There's a period of exhaustion, I think after the bushfires, and you feel an inability to write. And you write this: In between the pacing and the waiting, nothing made sense. I turned to description instead, struggling to move beyond observation to any deeper understanding. I took notes of shop owners standing out the front of empty stores, staring at the sky. Dad hosing the ash off my car as his grandson watched, fascinated, like all children, by hoses. Trees with alien regrowth barely recognisable as trees. I'm unable to pull these images into anything more than vignettes. So here's my question. Aren't vignettes enough?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that is probably the power of observation. And that comes back to what I was saying before, that struggle between critical analysis and how that offers depth, but actually turning into the essay as a personal form of writing that can offer a different type of depth. And in that sense, vignettes, yes, maybe they are enough if you're writing in that kind of observational mode. Can I say something about character?
Please.
If that's okay. It's quite different when you're writing within memoir, I think, as opposed to some of the analysis that David and Esther have touched upon. There's a really great advice from Deborah Levy that I think about when I'm writing, and the I is always we, she says. So if you... it is still a type of craft that it's not necessarily me. It is a version, and it is incredibly crafted, incredibly edited and refined down, but it is still a reflection of everyday real life, and how character operates within that dynamic is actually really interesting as an essayist.
We're talking about all of these essays are appearing in books, but of course they've appeared in original forms elsewhere in lots of different places. And in my country, David's book is a collection of pieces from newspapers, many different ones over the years, Mianjin, all those quarterly essays, books, speeches. Some of those, though, have been driven by the clarifying power of deadlines. And one of the great stories that I can think of was your quarterly essay about Rudd had a particularly resonant timing.
Well, yes. So I wrote a quarterly essay about Rudd and published it, and did a few speaking gigs about it. I thought that it had advanced the argument on Rudd, shone some light on the strange corners of his character. I was extremely pleased with myself because it had the best opening line I've ever written to a work. It's a quotation. "Those Chinese fuckers have rat fucked us," said
I think there's
Kevin
something
Rudd.
there for all of us.
And I can still remember walking up a beach at Mackay with him, and just him and me and two security guards walking along the beach one afternoon, and he said, "How does the essay begin?" And I told him, and I can still hear the sound of the sand squeaking as we walked along in complete silence for some time. Then I flew out because I'd had the kind of gig that a person of my age and distinction should have been given frequently, but never had. And that was an invitation to present a paper on Patrick White at the University of London. And so flew over to London, and I was there with my partner, and we're walking along, and my phone goes ping. And it was from a dear friend of mine saying, "Good thing you got the essay out when you did." I thought that's a bit odd. And so I messaged back, "What do you mean?" And she replied, "He's in the course of being sacked now." So my essays, the shelf life of my essay was about 10 days. But it's really good, it's worth remembering.
My minor version of that story was I used to be at the Australian as arts editor, and we had a section once. It was the 50 most important or powerful, influential people in the arts. And I had as number one Simon Crean because he'd just published his arts policy, which was a rare thing back then, and still kind of is. And Gillard, that was the day that he stood up against Gillard and was sacked.
But at least it was a daily. You think
Yes.
of the terrible position of people who publish weeklies. And, I mean...
Quarterly.
Quarterlies in a sense, nobody actually expects a quarterly to be absolutely up to date, but a weekly should be absolutely up to date. And of course, whenever anything important happens on a Friday, know that the Saturday paper has already gone to press. Yes.
It's a great problem with the Saturday paper published on Thursday, right? So I'm going to throw to the crowd in a moment. Before I do, have a little thought about jumping in. I want to ask about the future of the form, about the essays. Now, we can have a little whinge about no one buying newspapers and that sort of thing, or we can. What I'm going to encourage is something a little more positive, because these ideas and these skills are still being used, but in different formats. And I'm thinking Substack, for instance, and Gideon Hayes. I think one of the great writers that makes a living now, apart from writing a book a week, on Substack. But then, I don't know, Ezra Klein, surely his podcast, Essays of a Kind. Hester.
I am contractually obliged to encourage you all to subscribe to Meanjin, which is very handsome in print, and there are a few copies out there for sale. But I will say that I think it's fantastic, platforms like Substack that allow a writer to, draw an income that you can pay to subscribe on Substack, and that's fantastic. It's fantastic when you already know the writer to whose work you want to subscribe. The great thing about a journal like Meanjin is that you're going to encounter work. And in today's, really highly flattened online reading experience where you can be on your device and have the same experience of reading Substack or the New York Times or, whatever, it's so important that we take the opportunity, the way of dignifying great writing in print, but also the way that we pick up a journal as a reader. And maybe you've bought a particular journal for one particular piece, a poem or a work of fiction, but you flip through and then, oh, look, there's an essay on something I didn't expect. Oh, look, there's a poem that I've just finished reading an essay, and there's a poem on the facing page. And it's just made me completely stop in my tracks, and I need to read it aloud and really savour those words. The way that we read as readers, this is personal, it's social, it's political, it's how we contribute to, the Australia of the future. But I think, as David was saying earlier about, was it the New York Times you mentioned, or the New Yorker, where it'll say to you, this is how many minutes this is going to take to read. So you're kind of going, oh, okay, well, get comfortable here. We do need to recondition ourselves as readers, those who are very, perhaps too comfortable just flipping through things on a device. We need to re-embrace the book, or the book form, whether it is on a device or in print. And I don't see the essay going anywhere. This notion of the long read, which is what the essay tends to be known as these days, is only growing in popularity, particularly, as Ashley mentioned, Musk and Trump. Oh, my God. My goodness, imagine working, living in a country which has, proclaimed itself for so long as the leader of the free world, and they've elected people who are going about destroying cultural institutions, destroying universities, destroying departments of health, destroying arts institutions, museums, performing arts institutions, galleries, and so on. The time and the focus that we take to read and to think together has never been more important.
And David, you're on the wireless. Are you an optimist or a pessimist about the form?
Look, the essay is just an essential form. It's just a completely essential form. It will come on different carriages. But people of my age should not worry about people aged 30 and how they're going to read essays. They are going to read them perfectly naturally in the course of events, on their laptops, on their phones. It's just a different way of getting there. But the form itself is so important, and it's so handy. One of my favourite Australian words. The essay is handy. It'll survive because it's handy, and it'll come in different ways. I do think there's an interesting discussion to be had, not now, not today, about the crossover between essays and YouTube, and essays and interviews on the wireless. I do love the word wireless. And, you know, it's different ways of getting there. You know, we get to Goulburn these days by car. We once got there by train. Before that, we got there by stagecoach. But we will still... No, I'm not as confident that we'll want to go to Goulburn all our lives. But you get the feeling.
Okay, hands up. We can yell out, I think. Or do we have roving mics? No. Okay.
I guess, David, you touched on things, but is a podcast an essay? So that's one question. Second question is artificial intelligence, large language models, and SWOP.
And what was the last word, sir? Slop. Oh.
What's that?
Yeah.
It's now eating its own stuff and therefore producing even less good stuff than when it first came.
Exactly. So 2 great questions. The first one are podcasts, essays, and I think we should give that one to David. And the second one was about AI and slop. Have we all heard this expression, AI slop? You'll enjoy this expression in the winter edition of Meanjin, which will come out in July. But this notion that so much money and energy and so on is being fed into the large language models, as you were just saying, and what are they producing? Garbage. Just really sludgy, sloppy. Like that word, AI slop, has become the sort of catch-all expression there. I will briefly say I have an essay in the latest Griffith Review, which I don't think is the one that's for sale out there, but number 88, Culture Vultures, and it's called Resisting the Content Mindset. I'm on a one-lady mission, which has got many people who've joined, actually, to rid our vocabularies of the word content, which has become a catch-all for, art, essays, poetry, writing, etc. It's a self-exploitative term when we hear artists saying, I'm creating content. It's a terribly exploitative term when we hear gatekeepers using it, editors, etc., producers, I'm commissioning content. Content is filler that fills a particular gap. It fills the space between ads. It fills, when you engage in this content mindset, you think you just need to generate, using AI, some content to fill something. Well, no. We read and we commission essays, photography, news. That's the mindset that we should be in. So it's not just, as you say, that AI is generating slop, but also, contributing to the environmental crisis, but that the language around that, and particularly the word content, is feeding this self-exploitative cycle where even artists are starting to use it because they think that that's how they need to pitch their work, and that is a huge danger.
Content being that bit between ads. That's such a quaint idea, ads.
Yes. Are you saying that AI is giving content a bad name? Is that your argument? Hey, look, on podcasts, it depends what the podcast is about. I mean, the very best podcasts are actually narratives, and it is a wonderful way of storytelling. And the storytelling podcast is a beautiful, beautiful, new and powerful form. And there are some podcasts, of course, which are more essay-y, but I love podcasts that tell stories. And that particular area of stories, which I suppose we explore a lot under guidance from me at Late Night Live, The things we know a bit about, or we've forgotten about, or we're still curious about after all these years, let's nail it down. And those podcasts are wonderful. And so the rest is history. I'm a bit addicted to the rest is history. When, in God's name, are they going to execute Louis XVI? For God's sake. Sometime in the new year, I think. They're so slow about it. But podcasts are all kinds of things. Podcasts are a way of publishing extraordinary things. And then, of course, there is the audio book, which is terrific. But it's a terrible hazard for people like me who write a big, thick book about the frontier wars, because there are all those Aboriginal names which it turns out I have no idea how to pronounce. So when I was doing the audio book, I was messaging friends and contacts in various Indigenous communities to say, how do you pronounce this one? And they didn't come up with a common solution. Are you absolutely confident, Esther, about how to pronounce the name of your magazine?
This is a fantastic question, and the final piece in Essays That Changed Australia, and I have to read it because I won't be able to pronounce it. The final piece is called Maganjan, Mianjan, Miganjan, Mianjan, Maganjan, and it's written by Gudger Carey Charlton, who is a Yuggera elder. The very first thing I did when I started as editor of Mianjan is address the fraught issue about cultural sovereignty, that, you know, the name of the journal was basically borrowed, pinched, taken without permission in 1940. Now, Mianjan is a Turrbal and a Yuggera word for part of Brisbane, for a particular land formation in the centre of Brisbane. It's not the name for the entirety of Brisbane, just as Naarm is not the name for the entirety of Melbourne. And there is a big extent to which the journal, which has always been pronounced Mianjan, there's an extent to which we have been responsible for a particular spelling and a sort of widespread adoption of a word which is not necessarily the culturally correct name for Brisbane or for that part of Brisbane. So if you read Gudger Carey's piece, she is an elder but also a linguist, and she offers a cultural and a linguistic and a personal account of that word Mianjan for Brisbane, and as an elder and knowledge holder, Maganjan is the name that she espouses for Brisbane.
You've got it easy, though. There are at least 20 versions of Kamilaroi. Yeah.
With a
20.
Kamilaroi, Gamilaroi, Gamilaroi, and that's the thing, you know. These are oral cultures. I mean, just listening to David talking about, you know, the difference between a podcast and an essay, and this notion of narrative, and I'm just so struck. You know, I'm from a Greek culture. It's also very much a storytelling culture. We want to be told stories. We want to listen to stories, and we want to tell them. So perhaps narrative has that, you know, finds its oral home in a podcast. Whereas an essay, it can be a speech, an oration, but it's also something we read and where we find insight, and we can do it ourselves. We can have that dinner table conversation. But I love that there are forms of knowledge and communication exchange, some of which are oral, some of which are oral, some of which are written, and they all evolve in these extraordinary ways that we're all a part of every day.
Looking around to see, because we have only a few minutes left, but are there any burning questions before I jump in? Oh, okay, hi.
Hi, I'd just like to hear a little bit more about Brooks' book,
Mm-hmm.
because I hail from Wollongong, grew up there. I know Jarvis Bay, as we learned Townsend, and I'm really very interested in your writing.
Thank you. What would you like to know? So it begins when I relocated to, we call Jervis Bay, when you live in Jervis Bay, about 6 years ago now, just after my son was born, because my parents had already retired there, and I did spend a lot of weekends down the coast. It was an opportunity to have babysitters, basically. The essays are all on different subjects, from the bushfires, which Ashley mentioned. There's also one about swimming with the grey nurse sharks in the bay. There's a lot about the landscape and the environment and the different towns that I lived in and kind of moved around, and the people that I met there and became friends with eventually. So there's a lot of love, and there's a lot of I don't know how else
It's a
would I
lovely
say
book,
it?
and there's a lot of chickens.
There's chickens.
Let's not forget that.
There's dogs. There's all sorts.
I think we've got 2 minutes. We can squeeze in another. Come on. Okay, in the front here. Hi.
Did you eat Sunday roast?
I'm fairly.
The question is, did you eat Sunday roast?
I didn't, but I'm very sure that Amy and Lindsay did.
Was the rule in your house,
The
as
fate
it
of
was in
this.
mine, that you ate the chooks only when they were too old to lay eggs anymore?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
I think that's the general rule.
It gives you a very particular view of chicken as a meat, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yes, but it's always when the older the chicken, the less tasty they are too.
Whereas in my family, I come from a long line of goat herders on my mother's side. It's work that I've done as well. It would never have occurred to us to name the animals.
One last one over here.
Mine would probably need a whole essay to hear the answer to, but David, your book Killing Country, oh God, it was just so important, as hard as it is to read. I have to read it in bits, but truth at last, where we were brought up on, idealistic.
That's very kind of you to say, but my book, and I wrote it with my partner, Sebastian Tesserero, who is here. My book comes after 40 years of truth-telling. And I think it's very important that we continue to acknowledge those who began to look at Australian history in a completely different way. Those historians. There's an interesting tradition of fiction writers in Australia being quite frank about violence on the frontier. But the history writers began, and at the same time that the great poet Judith Wright was one of the first books to be published in this tradition, and it has been going on for 40 years. But thank you. There is a great deal more to be written, and I had no idea, after the unhappy discovery of my great-great-grandfather's career, I had no idea how much material was available. No. And so, yes, it's a fat book, and it's in many ways horrifying. Thank you.
Could I just very briefly add to that? I was a member of the jury that shortlisted this very important book for the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Non-Fiction last year, and part of the huge discussion that we had as jury members there was that truth-telling cannot be in this place something that only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do. And we need your book to have set a standard and raised the bar, especially now that we're starting to hear at the Commonwealth level about truth-telling. Obviously in Victoria we have a process, etc. But it has to be something that we all take responsibility for. So thank you again, David, for that book.